Hey, what's going on, guys? Earlier today, Conor McGregor tweeted out he will be announcing his fight date and next opponent on New Year's Day, January 1st, 2024, which just so happens to coincide with the ending of the UFC and USADA's partnership, the independent drug testing company the UFC uses. And I wanted to make a video going through potential opponents for Conor McGregor and who I think he's going to fight next and where I think he's going to fight next and on what card I think he's going to fight on next. But I also wanted to discuss that theory because there's a theory that I've had regarding Conor McGregor and USADA over the past month or two that I wanted to wait and see how this situation played out, because a lot of people have said, well, they're just waiting for the USADA deal to end. But most people who have said that haven't really offered anything of substance behind it. Like, why specifically are they waiting for the USADA deal to end? And I'll tell you right now, I'm going to go through the theory a little bit later in the video, that I believe there is a good possibility that Conor McGregor failed a USADA test. And I'm going to break down the one detail that everybody else is missing. Nobody has talked about it. I've not seen any single person, media member or otherwise, even mention this detail. And it's one of those loopholes that could easily cover up a failed test by Conor McGregor. But let's start by going through potential opponents for Conor McGregor. As you guys know, and I've made countless videos on this, so I don't want to spend too much time, Conor McGregor was announced as the Ultimate Fighter coach back in early February of 2023. And basically, it was a foregone conclusion that him and Michael Chandler were going to coach the Ultimate Fighter, and then they were going to fight at the end of it. Well, when this initially was announced, I said, look, I don't think this happens. I don't believe it happens in 2023. I don't believe this fight probably doesn't happen at all. Now, there's still a chance that fight happens, but I was laughed at. I was crucified. And sure enough, here it is, December 30th, at the time of this recording, and Conor McGregor is still not booked against Michael Chandler. And now I feel like the majority of the MMA community has flipped to my side and said, you know what? I don't think Conor McGregor is going to fight Michael Chandler anymore. It doesn't seem like that. And we'll talk about Michael Chandler as an opponent in a minute. But essentially, the full backstory, without going too much into the details, is Conor McGregor broke his leg in July of 2021 against Dustin Poirier. He left the USADA testing pool, presumably to abuse banned substances to help heal his leg. But where I had a problem with it was that doesn't take 3 years. You don't have to abuse PEDs for 3 years. And if you want to say, Joey, you don't know that he was abusing PEDs. He left the testing pool, and then December or November of last year, he tweeted out, I'll be cleared for testing in February. Well, cleared for testing, what does that mean? Oh, I'll be off any banned substances. Well, sure enough, February came and went, March came and went, so on and so forth, and he still did not enter the USADA testing pool until I believe it was October of 2023. He finally entered the USADA pool. And the reason I didn't think this fight was going to happen is because with the USADA deal, once you re-entered the USADA pool, there was a 6-month waiting period. So once he entered the USADA pool, he had to wait 6 months before he could actually fight if they wanted to apply the same rules they apply to everyone else to their star in Conor McGregor. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's get into actual opponents, because now Conor's saying, I'm going to announce my next opponent on January 1st, 2024. And even if it doesn't happen on New Year's Day, I believe it will happen in the next week or so, because I do believe it's a card that is imminent and they need to announce the main event for. So who are some potential opponents? I have 5 potential opponents I'm going to go through rather quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I have 2 kind of unrealistic opponents that are very, very small percentage of possibility. And then I have 3 very realistic opponents that I believe will be one of the 3. So starting off, I believe there is a possibility, a very small shot at Conor McGregor versus George St. Pierre. I know that sounds crazy. And I know that sounds like I just pulled it out of thin air. But George St. Pierre has always kind of hinted at wanting the Conor McGregor fight. He was sitting in the crowd at UFC 229. And there's been rumors flying left and right about George St. Pierre returning at UFC 300. And George St. Pierre, what he showed us in the past by cherry picking Michael Bisping as the middleweight champion, it wouldn't shock me if GSP is looking at Conor McGregor saying, you know what? I'll come back and cherry pick another win, and it'll be one of the biggest fights the UFC can make, and I'll make tens of millions of dollars, and I'll get an easy win. I think that's what GSP would be thinking. I don't think this is super likely, and that's why I'm kind of going in order of likeliness, but I think it's possible, so I wanted to mention it on the list. Okay, moving on to the next opponent, because I want to go through these pretty fast. I think there's a possibility we get Conor McGregor versus Charles Oliveira. Again, this is just a little bit more likely than the George St. Pierre fight. This would be a massive fight. This is a fight that Charles Oliveira has said he's won it for a while. And the reason I don't think this fight is super likely is because I think the UFC wants to get Conor McGregor a win. And even if they're not going to give him a Dennis Seaver, I think Charles Oliveira is pretty tough for a comeback fight. And Conor McGregor's been open about saying, I kind of want a tune-up fight. And, if it was anybody else, any other sport, they'd be giving me a tune-up fight. So I just don't know if Charles Oliveira, former lightweight champion, coming off the destruction of Beneil Dariush, I don't know if that's the matchup the UFC wants to make, but I'll tell you right now, that's the fight the fans want, or a lot of fans want. That is a banger matchup. Imagine that in both in their primes, if Conor was in his prime. But I don't think that ultimately happens, but that is a possibility because Charles Oliveira is kind of like a low to mid-tier draw in the UFC, and they're trying to build him up as like the next Brazilian star. And he's honestly trending that way. And a win over Conor McGregor would build Charles Oliveira into that star they want. But I don't think that's a fight that Conor McGregor wants really, at least not right now. And I don't think it's a fight the UFC wants. But it would also put Conor McGregor right into the title mix. And I think the UFC's future plan with Conor is to get him a win or two and then hopefully book Islam Makhachev versus Conor McGregor, because that would be a mega fight. Okay, now moving on to the realistic opponents. Starting off with number 3. That is Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 4. I think this is a real possibility. I genuinely think this is a real possibility. Conor McGregor fought him 3 times. He won the first fight way back when. Then they fought at UFC 257. Dustin Poirier knocked him out. And then most recently at UFC 264, Dustin Poirier was dominating him. Then Conor McGregor broke his leg. So there is that narrative, even though I don't believe that narrative, there is that narrative that it was kind of a fluke win for Dustin Poirier and that Conor McGregor could have won that fight and that if he didn't break his leg, maybe he would have won. And there's that whole narrative there. And also, Conor McGregor's a madman. He's super competitive. Every time he loses, he desperately wants that fight back. That's why they fought for a 3rd time, because Dustin knocked him out at UFC 257. That's why Conor McGregor is still obsessed with Khabib Nurmagomedov, because he desperately wants that fight back. And I think with Michael Chandler sucking up and whatnot, and people kind of being off on the Michael Chandler matchup, I think there's a chance that Conor says, you know what, give me Dustin Poirier. Give me Dustin Poirier. I want to right that wrong. I broke my leg. I would have won that fight. I'm better than ever now. I've improved in my time off. And I think there's a chance that we could get Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 4, and that would be a mega matchup, honestly. That would sell a lot of pay-per-views. And also, Dustin Poirier is coming off a KO loss against Justin Gaethje. I'm telling you right now, when Conor McGregor saw Justin Gaethje knock out Dustin Poirier, knock him out cold, Conor McGregor was like that meme of the guy behind the tree rubbing his hands together. And I think that knockout loss for Dustin Poirier increased his chances of getting a Conor McGregor 4th fight, because now Conor's looking at him as a winnable matchup. He's taken a beating. He's taken some damage. He got flat out knocked out cold in his last fight. And Conor's like, okay, maybe I can win that fight now. Maybe I can right that wrong. And for Dustin Poirier, it makes sense, because why wouldn't you want to take this fight if you're Dustin Poirier? Oh, I've beat him in the last 2 fights pretty dominantly. And I don't want to fight up and comers like Arman Tsarukyan. He's been very vocal about that. Why not take a 4th Conor McGregor fight? If I was Dustin Poirier, I'd be begging for a 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. I'd be like, easy wins. And, it's not an up-and-coming savage like an Arman Tsarukyan or a Jalen Turner, which Dustin Poirier has shown that he doesn't want. Okay, moving on to my second matchup, or my second to last matchup. That is Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. Even though I've been adamant since the very beginning that I don't believe Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler happens, and that's why it's not number 1, I could see Dana White saying, you know what, we promised the fans this. We recorded a whole Ultimate Fighter season. Let's just make it happen. And Michael Chandler has lost 3 out of his last 4. The only win he has is against the dead carcass, the rotting carcass of Tony Ferguson. And, I think initially when this fight was booked, it was booked because they thought, you know what, if you look at the top 5, top 6 of the lightweight division, Michael Chandler was the most manageable matchup. And I think that's why they booked this fight, and that's why they booked him on the Ultimate Fighter. But I don't think Conor really wants the Chandler fight. Conor's out there getting drunk, looking at videos on Twitter, inappropriate videos on Twitter, out there doing drugs, snorting coke. And Michael Chandler's just in the gym every day, stalking Conor McGregor's Instagram, probably has a picture of Conor McGregor shirtless on his heavy bag. And Chandler has explosive power. All he cares about is training. All he cares about is fighting Conor McGregor. He's been studying and stalking Conor McGregor for a year and a half now. I just don't know if Conor wants that fight. And also, to be honest, the fans don't really want it anymore because Michael Chandler's groveling and sucking up have kind of put fans off on this fight. I mean, he's been brown-nosing Conor McGregor so much he can tell you what Conor had for dinner last night. That's how bad it's been. I mean, Michael Chandler desperately wants Conor McGregor to take him into the NBA Finals public restroom. I'll say that much right now. So it's just one of those fights where I could see the UFC going in that direction and saying, okay, this is what we promised the fans. But why would Conor say, we're going to announce my next opponent? Well, we already announced your next opponent, and it was Michael Chandler. So why wouldn't Conor just say, oh, we're going to announce the date for my next fight on New Year's Day? And there's a chance that Conor's trolling here, and it's not even going to get announced on New Year's Day. I do believe it will be announced in the month of January. I do believe it will be announced soon, but maybe it's not actually on the 1st. But Dana White and Conor McGregor did meet the other day. So that's why I think the fight is imminent. A fight announcement is imminent, but I don't know if it's Michael Chandler. And that's why Michael Chandler is not my number one option here, because my number one option is the fight that I believe actually happens, and that is Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 3. I don't particularly love this fight. I don't particularly hate it, but I think it makes perfect sense for all parties involved. That is one of the biggest fights the UFC can make. Conor McGregor wants a tune-up fight. Nate Diaz has gone on decline. I think if there's any fight right now for Conor McGregor to return where he can get a win after a damn near 3-year layoff, I think it's Nate Diaz, who's getting beat up by YouTubers, who didn't even look that good against the dead carcass of Tony Ferguson. I know he went out there and he, rocked Leon Edwards in the 5th round. That's meaningless at this point. Nate has gone on the decline. Conor has been adamant the trilogy's happening at one point or another. Conor McGregor's manager recently spoke maybe 2 weeks ago saying, we want that Nate Diaz fight, and that Nate Diaz trilogy will happen eventually. And you have Nate Diaz turning down a $15 million offer from PFL to fight Jake Paul in MMA. Why would he turn down that $15 million offer? Well, because there's a better offer, and that offer is Conor McGregor. So I do believe that it will be Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz. That is announced. And as far as a date, regardless of what fight it is, I believe the main event of UFC 300 will be Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz versus Michael Chandler versus Dustin Poirier. I believe it will be one of those 3 fights. I think if I had to put a percentage on it, I'll say like maybe 65% it's Nate Diaz. That's what I would go with. Maybe 20% it's Michael Chandler. Honestly, that's kind of too high. And then maybe 15% Dustin Poirier. But honestly, I just don't feel like Chandler gets this fight at all. I don't feel like he gets it at all. But I believe, and I've said this for the last couple months, maybe 2 months now, I've kind of nailed down my prediction for UFC 300. I believe it will be Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz as the main event of 300. Now let's get to the USADA portion of this, because Conor McGregor left the USADA pool because of his injury to use banned substances, and he's finally re-entered the USADA pool back in October. Well, what also happened in October? Well, the USADA announced that the partnership with the UFC was ending effective January 1st, 2023. Now let's take a look at what USADA had to say. I underlined, this is the full statement, but I underlined the notable portions of this statement. As of January 1st, 2024, USADA will no longer be involved with the UFC anti-doping program. And then also, we will continue to provide our unparalleled service to UFC athletes through the remainder of our contract, which ends December 31st, 2023. Well, that's awfully convenient that it's going to end the same day that Conor McGregor is going to announce his next fight. And I know a lot of people have thrown out that theory. A lot of people, even in my chat, has said, you know what, I think they're waiting for the USADA deal to end. But no one has actually substantiated that claim and say, here's why. They just said, oh, they're waiting for the USADA deal to end. I've been thinking about this for about a month or two, and I've had this theory, but I wanted to wait and see, okay, they're going to actually wait till January to announce this fight. I thought it might come in December. I believe there's a chance that Conor McGregor tested positive for, in the USADA program. He re-entered the USADA program in October, the same time that statement, in that very statement that I didn't read, was Conor McGregor re-entering the USADA testing pool. Well, Joey, if he tested positive, wouldn't we already know about that? No, you would not already know about that because of a rule change back in 2018, and I've not seen one media member or otherwise mention this. There was a rule change back in 2018, and I'll put it up on the screen. I've underlined the important parts. Its policy has been to immediately announce any potential violation. In mid-July, however, the UFC decided to change its policy and now announce a violation, typically a failed drug test, only after the case has been resolved. So what exactly does that mean? It used to be the UFC's policy where the second someone popped for a test, banned substance, whatever it may be, they would immediately announce it. But what would happen is they would be found guilty until proven innocent. So, they would announce Conor McGregor tested positive for a substance. They would investigate it, find it to be a tainted supplement or something along those lines. And then it would be a reduced suspension. And that would all come out in appeal and investigation. And they felt like it was unfair to the athletes. And I kind of agree with this. It was unfair that we're announcing it, then investigating it, when it could be a litany of circumstances other than the fighter actually cheating. And they felt like fighters were being labeled as cheaters when then later they'd be vindicated. But the retraction doesn't get as much publicity as the original statement of a failed drug test. So what they did was they changed it back in 2018, where if you tested positive, it would not be announced until you went through all the appeals and the investigation and the eventual maybe arbitration from an independent party, independent of USADA. And then once all that was completed over the course of 6 months, 8 months, even a year, then they would announce the final result. So they may test positive, nobody knows. They investigate it, they rule on their findings, then the fighter has the ability to appeal it, and then they can go to arbitration, and then there's all these different kind of checks and balances throughout the USADA program. Then once everything has been put through that process, when they finally have the result of what's come out of all those investigations and the arbitration, then they finally announce it. Well, guess what? Conor McGregor enrolled in USADA in October, mid-October, I believe it was October 11th. Let's say he tested positive in November. Let's say he tested positive in December. Those appeals, those arbitrations, all that stuff would not have been finished yet. But guess what? If he tested positive, USADA, and I couldn't find this written anywhere, but also USADA said, we will not make any statements on failed drug test unless the fighter makes a statement on a failed drug test or announces a fight or something along those lines. So basically, if you tested positive and you're going through the investigation and you're going through the arbitration process, USADA is not allowed to say a word about it. That's the new program. But if a fighter makes a statement on it or the UFC makes a statement on it, then USADA is able to come out and make a statement on it. Well, guess what? If Conor then tested positive and is going through this arbitration and this appeal and this investigation, they could just wait it out. They could just wait it out till January, because then guess what happens in January? January 1st or December 31st, the deal is officially over. And then what happens from there is the UFC says, we'll take this from here. USADA never gets to say a word about it because that would be a violation of the deal that they concocted together. And then Conor McGregor gets to go on his merry way. I believe Conor only entered USADA back in October for optics. It looked bad if Conor just waited till the end of USADA in January and then he all of a sudden shows back up. It looks horrible. So he said, you know what? I'll enter in October. Even if I test positive, I'll appeal it. And then by the time the USADA deal's over, we won't even be through the appeals process. And the UFC can say, oh, we'll take it from here. And then guess what? The UFC acts like this new USADA, or not USADA, this new drug testing deal. They act like it's independent. This new drug testing program the UFC is instituting January 1st, it's not independent at all. Essentially what the UFC is doing, and I'll make a dedicated video on it if you guys want it. The UFC has started up a shell company. They've hired all these third-party companies to collect samples, and they've hired a head of that shell company to be the person that hands out punishments and announces positive tests. And the UFC and Hunter Campbell and Jeff Nowitzki has basically come out when they did a press conference. I did an entire video, and I'll link it down in the description. You can go check it out. But essentially what they said is, we're ditching USADA because they're too strict. I mean, that's not a direct quote, but if you read between the lines, that's basically what they said at that press conference. I encourage you to go check out that. I think it's like an hour-long video I did on it. But I'll do another video on, the updated rules of the new drug testing program for the UFC. But I believe what's going to happen is anything USADA is currently working on, they just hand it over to the UFC. Then the UFC can easily bury it. And the reason I believe that Conor's not fighting till UFC 300 is all because of optics. They re-entered Conor McGregor into the testing pool in October, all for optics. If he tests positive, it doesn't matter because it will never come to light. And then if Conor doesn't fight till April anyway, he still abided by that 6-month waiting period that a lot of people have been talking about. So I think it's not a guarantee by any means. This is pure speculation. I think the reason they waited till January 1st or after to announce Conor McGregor's next fight is because if they announced it USADA could come out and say, and it was in the agreement, they could come out and say, no, Conor McGregor shouldn't be fighting. He tested positive from a sample collected on, name any date between October 11th and then. They're going to say, oh, in mid-November, Conor McGregor, a sample that was collected, he tested positive for. But guess what? If the UFC waits till after the USADA deal's over, USADA doesn't get to come out and say anything because USADA is now disconnected from the UFC. It would not shock me at all. We've always had these kind of theories regarding UFC and USADA, and I believe the UFC has tried to put pressure on USADA to kind of be more lenient with certain rules, but they haven't been willing to do such, and therefore that is why the UFC is parting ways with USADA, and they're hiring a guy, and they're like, this guy, interrogated Saddam Hussein. This guy was on 60 Minutes not once, but twice. And I think the reason the UFC has come out and kind of trashed USADA is because they're not happy with the way USADA has handled the Conor McGregor situation. They're saying, oh, we issued a legal letter because what USADA has done has been disgusting. They're using Conor McGregor as a media vehicle. I 100% believe this. Conor McGregor was the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to the UFC and USADA deal. I 100% believe that is the reason they're parting ways, is because of differences of opinion regarding Conor McGregor and the randomized drug testing. And I think there is a good chance Conor could have popped under USADA's testing in the last 2 months, but it will never come to light. And the UFC will easily bury it under their new program because they just want to have Conor McGregor back in the cage, because Conor McGregor is the only fighter out there that's selling above 1 million pay-per-view buys. And that is the truth, and that is my theory. And you will see nobody else mention, maybe now when somebody sees this, will not mention that rule that they changed in 2018 where they don't announce it until after the completion of the entire investigation and arbitration. So ultimately, I think Conor McGregor fights on April 13th at UFC 300 against Nate Diaz, regardless if he's tested positive for PEDs or not, because the new in-house UFC testing program will never, ever, ever pull someone like Conor McGregor from a fight for a positive test result. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to get to 15,000 subscribers before the end of the year. We're cutting it very close, but let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you in the next video.